It's October 4th, 2023. Welcome to Political Dharma with Alan Zundell. Support among registered voters for Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign for the presidency has risen, according to a recent public opinion poll. 2 weeks ago, I discussed an Ipsos poll, which showed RFK at 14% in a hypothetical matchup against Joe Biden and Donald Trump. That poll was taken across the dates of October 3rd and October 4th. But this week, Quinnipiac University released its poll taken 3 weeks after that, from October 26th through October 30th, not long ago, and after RFK had declared that he was leaving the Democratic primary to run as an independent. In this more recent poll, RFK has risen to 22% when up against Biden and Trump, a rise of about 8 percentage points. In today's episode, I'll be taking a closer look at that poll, particularly to see where Kennedy's support is coming from. I also want to discuss Kennedy's campaign as a possible catalyst for a party realignment in 2024 and beyond. On last week's show, I talked about the 1992 presidential campaign, in which Ross Perot won about 19% of the popular vote. That's close to what Kennedy is polling at now, but not a single electoral college vote. I was making the point that the electoral college is going to be a significant obstacle to Kennedy winning the presidency, even if his level of support rose to a high level. In that show 2 weeks ago, I also discussed the 1912 election, in which former President Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate and did win 88 electoral votes from several states, which you can see in yellow on the map if you're watching this as a video, but he still didn't win the election. That map is from the website 2070towin.com. But it occurred to me last week that I was forgetting a more pertinent presidential election and much more recent than the 2012, much more recent than the 1912 election. And that is the presidential election of 1968. In 1968, Alabama Governor George Wallace ran as a candidate of the American Independent Party and won 46 electoral college votes, all of them from the South, which you can see colored tan on screen. The states colored blue were won by Democrat Hubert Humphrey, and the states colored red were won by Republican Richard Nixon, who ultimately won the election. The significant thing about the 1968 election is not only that there was a strong third-party candidate who won a lot of electoral votes, well, maybe not a lot, but some electoral votes, which is a feat in itself, but that Wallace's winning of those southern states from the Democrats broke up the New Deal coalition, which had been supporting the Democratic Party for several decades, and caused a change in the balance of power between the two major parties. I'll be talking about that more in a minute or so, and about how Kennedy's campaign might have a similar impact in 2024. But before I do that, first I want to say something about the conflict in the Middle East, which is, for good reasons, on the front page of the news lately. Given the potential for this crisis to spiral out of control and involve other countries, I think it's important for me to state publicly and join my voice with those who are calling for a ceasefire in this current conflict. Now, the question is, what comes after a ceasefire, if we're even able to get a ceasefire, which it doesn't look like we're going to get. But what would I call for after a ceasefire? It's an important question to answer. What I'd call for may seem incredible, but that is giving up the belief that military power and violence can actually settle international conflicts or really any significant conflicts in our world, and instead adopting a posture of developing our abilities to cooperate with other nations and other peoples and build a more peaceful, just world for the acting for the well-being of all human beings on the planet. I think that has to start with each of us. And for myself, I've been over my lifetime trying to rid myself of any sense of using fear or coercion in my political efforts or interrelationships and trying to proactively work towards, use nonviolent means towards working for a better world. And that is what I have to say about that. But let's turn back to the upcoming 2024 election to talk about Kennedy's campaign and how it may have an effect of realigning between the two major parties. From 1932, when Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt won the presidency, to 1969, when Democrat President Lyndon Johnson left office, the U.S. government was dominated by the Democratic Party. This was the era of the New Deal coalition, which Roosevelt built when he won office and began an ambitious national policy program to overcome the economic crisis of the Great Depression and ensure the economic welfare of citizens. That coalition included blue-collar workers, farmers, Southern Democrats, liberal intellectuals, blacks, and other groups. The only Republican president during this whole period was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who didn't put up a strong challenge to the New Deal programs. Democrats controlled both houses of the U.S. Congress during that period, except for just 4 of those 36 years. The graphic you see on the video is from the Spokesman Review at spokesman.com. The election of 1932 was called a realigning election because it switched what kind of voters were supporting which of the two major parties. Afterward, there was relative stability in party composition and predictability in which parties were going to win which states for the electoral vote in the presidential election, and which parties were going to send what kind of representatives and senators to the U.S. Congress. But those kinds of alignments, and by alignment, I mean the lining up of particular blocks of voters behind a particular major political party and fairly consistently voting for those parties. An alignment doesn't last forever, and one of the main reasons is that the older voters who were part of the original coalition start to die off, and younger voters who were not affected directly by the crisis that precipitated the alignment start to come of age and become voters. That is, voters who would not have remembered the Great Depression start to come of age, and the ties to the Democratic Party based on that New Deal coalition and memories of the Great Depression start to loosen up a bit. So that was what happened in 1968. New issues came up that were more pertinent to young voters, like civil rights and the Vietnam War. And when Lyndon Johnson, the president at the time, chose to support civil rights and passed 2 major civil rights bills, including in 1965, the Voting Rights Act that allowed Black Americans which did more to enfranchise Black American voters where they were not being given the right to vote, even though they constitutionally had that right. That disenchanted a lot of Southern voters from the Democratic Party and started to peel them off from supporting the Democrats. Now, when George Wallace decided to run, he was a Democratic governor, but he was from a Southern state, Alabama, and he saw the opportunity to try to affect the outcome of the presidential election by running as a third-party candidate, and especially running within the Southern states, peeling them off from the Democratic Party coalition. This made them available later for the Republicans to begin pursuing, which they did. The end result was a new alignment in which Republicans typically gained the presidency with the help of the Electoral College votes in the Southern states, while Democrats continued to hold the Congress, as you can see again on your screen. 24 years later, the 1992 election, in which Ross Perot ran, which I mentioned earlier, created another realignment, or precipitated another realignment, in which the presidency became more competitive between the parties, while Republicans were more successful in controlling Congress. As in 1968, the 1992 election had a strong third-party candidate, and that showed that voters were ready for a change. By 1992, the issues of the 1960s, like the Vietnam War, were becoming old history to younger voters. What issues replaced them? I would say it was principally the issues of religion and sexuality. Evangelical Christians started to become more organized, especially in the Southern states. around the issue of abortion and began gaining seats in Congress, so that Congress was starting to move towards the Republicans, which the anti-abortion forces and the evangelical Christians became more allied with, the Republican Party. And on the other side, when Ross Perot ran, even though his big issue was the national debt, he started to attract northeastern liberals, northeastern secular liberals who were kind of disenchanted by the Republican Party's turn towards the issue of abortion. So there was the opportunity now for the Democratic Party to seek out more secular and culturally liberal people on the West Coast and in the Northeast in the major population centers. Meanwhile, gay rights activists were also becoming organized, and they started to ally with the Democratic Party by making it an issue of civil rights rather than an issue of sexual morality. The Democratic presidential candidates from Bill Clinton onward gained an electoral college advantage in the big population centers on the West Coast, like San Francisco and Los Angeles and Seattle, and also in northeastern states like New York and Philadelphia, which tend to be more culturally liberal and less culturally conservative than the southern and other states. Let's take a look at maps showing the change in the Electoral College votes from 1988 to 1992. In 1988, Republican red states dominate the map, except for a few Democratic blue states, particularly in the upper Midwest. This was typical of the 1980s, the era of Ronald Reagan and then George Bush the first following him. Then when you get to the 1992 election, the one in which Ross Perot ran, and it was Clinton versus Bush, you suddenly have a bunch of blue states appearing across the West Coast, the Midwest, and the Northeast. That pattern is held right up through the 2020 election. It's now been just over 30 years since the 1992 election, about time for especially younger voters to start loosening their ties to particular major parties and responding to different types of issues. That makes Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign as an independent candidate particularly interesting to see who's going to support him. So let's go back to the Quinnipiac poll and take a look at which kinds of groups are supporting Kennedy's campaign. First of all, we see a high level of support from independents, the voters who feel less attached to the current party alignments. Among independents, his support is at 36% compared to 30% for Biden and 31% for Trump, so ahead of both of the major party candidates. Second, we see his support highest with younger voters and declining with voters' age. Among voters 18 to 34 years of age, his support is at 38% compared to 32% for Biden and 27% for Trump. His support goes down to 21% in the 35 to 49-year-old age category, below Biden's 35% and Trump's 40%. And in the 50 to 64-year-old age category, Kennedy's support goes down again, this time to 17%, while Biden and Trump's support stays about the same. In the age category of 65 years old and over, Kennedy's support goes down to 14%, while Biden's support goes up and Trump's support goes down. As you would expect with realignment theory, younger voters are less attached to current party loyalties than older voters. Oddly, RFK also has a high level of support from Hispanic voters, 33% compared to 36% for Biden and 27% for Trump. I'm not sure exactly why this is, but I suspect it has to do with Hispanics' memory of his father, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., and his ties to Cesar Chavez and other leaders of the United Farm Workers, which mostly represented Mexican and Mexican-American agricultural workers. It would be interesting to see if the support for Kennedy is different between younger Hispanics and older Hispanics, the latter of whom would probably be more apt to remember the ties of his father with Hispanic causes. As for younger voters, I think they're primarily responding to two issues. One is climate change, and Kennedy's support for environmental issues is much stronger than that of Biden and Trump. So he's got a record on that where they don't. The other one is young people's sense of vulnerability economically, especially with things like the cost of education, which entails student debt, and the cost of housing, which neither major party has very effectively addressed so far. Kennedy, I don't know if he's addressed those specifically, but I do know he's making a point of attacking corporate control of the major parties and how the parties are therefore not responding to the economic concerns of ordinary voters. So both those messages, one on climate change and environmental matters, and one on the corporate control of both major parties and their lack of responsiveness to younger voters' concerns, especially their economic concerns, are probably driving the support among younger voters for Kennedy's campaign. Now let's look at RFK's favorability ratings. His favorability is about the same in all age categories, except the 65 plus voters who see him more negatively. But his unfavorability is lowest among young voters and goes up as voters get older. The youngest voters are also the most likely to say they don't know enough about Kennedy to decide if they favor him or not, which means that Kennedy could pick up a lot more support in the 18 to 34-year-old age category as he becomes better known. Women are more unfavorable toward Kennedy than men are, which I think probably has to do with the issue of abortion. Kennedy is a committed Roman Catholic, and his early statements on abortion did not seem to be very pro-choice, which I think hurt him among women. Hispanics are much more favorable than unfavorable towards Kennedy, 48% to 28%, which goes along with what I said earlier. Now compare that to Black Americans, who are more unfavorable than favorable toward Kennedy by about the same percentages. So it shows there's something different among Hispanics than other minority groups like Black Americans. Kennedy has high favorability among independents, as we would expect, with 39% of them viewing him favorably and only 26 unfavorably. The rest haven't heard enough about him yet to decide. Notably, Democrats rate him much more unfavorable than favorable, 63% to 14%, while Republicans rate him the opposite, 41% favorable to 22% unfavorable. I think that's largely because he was being talked up by Republicans when he was running against Biden in the Democratic primary, and they thought that might hurt Biden's electability. But now that he's moved to being an independent candidate, and it seems like he's taking potential support from Trump, I think they're going to change and start attacking him, which may not hurt him so much with Republican voters who, are still going to see his vaccine skepticism as attractive, at least certain segments of the mega Republicans. But it may help him with the Democrats when he starts to be painted more and more as liberal by the Republicans. The Democrats might start seeing him in a somewhat different light than they currently do. His other high unfavorability ratings comes from women again and voters with a 4-year college degree. I think college-educated voters probably see him negatively because his questioning of vaccine safety is usually painted as being anti-science in the media. Haven't looked into it very deeply myself to know how to accurately characterize his stance on this. I intend to do that going forward. What we can say so far is that younger voters and independents like him, as we would expect, heading toward a possible realigning election. Also, women dislike him and Hispanics like him for reasons I'm at this time speculating about, and don't know how much that's going to change as things go forward and people get to know Kennedy better. So let's look at one more thing. If we throw Cornell West into the mix in the presidential election, do voters' opinions change? When the race is between Biden, Trump, Kennedy, and West, Cornell West is still pretty low, with 6% of registered voters supporting him. His presence, though, took 3 percentage points away from Kennedy and 3 from Biden as well, only 1 from Trump, but hardly changing their relative levels of support. West got 8% from independents, again, taking 3 percentage points from Kennedy and 3 from Biden and 1 from Trump. Like Kennedy, West's support is highest among younger voters and declines with age, although he doesn't show the same kind of support from Hispanic voters as RFK is attracting. Kennedy's support from Hispanics stays about the same with West in the race, while Hispanic support for Biden and Trump declines slightly. So Cornell West is not showing so much progress so far, and I expect that he's not going to be able to get in the ballot in many states, so he's not going to be a major factor in the 2024 election. I do think the polling results showing him stronger among younger voters is another indication that this could be a realigning election coming up, although I think it'll redound to the benefit of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. rather than Cornell West. I think that the Kennedy's campaign is going to shake up the party system in this coming election, and how things shake out will affect future elections going forward. Let me say one more thing about parallels between 1968 and this current era that we're living through right now, because some of them are kind of strange. Not only is there a strong independent or third party candidate in both of those races, George Wallace in 1968, and now it looks like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is going to be a strong independent for 2024. The leading candidate in the Democratic nomination process was in both years an incumbent president. Of course, right now it's Joe Biden. In 1967, at the end of 1967, just before the election year, the incumbent president was Democrat Lyndon Johnson. And he looked so strong that no other major Democratic figures were going to challenge him. Now that changed. In early 1968, in January 1968, there was a major offensive by the Viet Cong in the North Vietnamese army in Vietnam, and it set back Johnson's approval ratings because he kept promising that the end was near and that we were winning in the Vietnam War. And this demonstrated to people that we were not anywhere near winning and the thing wasn't over. So because of that, Eugene McCarthy, who was an anti-war Democrat, decided he was going to enter the New Hampshire primary. And when he got a surprisingly large share of the vote, both him and Johnson were in the 40% range, with Johnson a little bit ahead of McCarthy. It showed that Johnson had become weakened and he subsequently dropped out of the race. I don't know that that's going to happen to Biden, but Biden also is kind of vulnerable, mostly around this issue of age. And there are candidates like Dean Phillips, most recently, who have stepped into the primary because they think Biden is vulnerable. Whether that's going to result in some kind of setback, and in New Hampshire this time around, which is going to hold the earliest primary for the Democrats, Biden's not even going to be on the ballot because he decided he wanted North Carolina to go first, and they're not going to participate in the New Hampshire primary. So it may well be that one of the other candidates has some kind of breakthrough in New Hampshire that weakens Biden going forward. So maybe there'll be a parallel there as well, although, things wouldn't likely match up that closely. So in both cases, you had the presidential incumbent as the Democratic nominee who was not that, who say the Democratic base was not that enthusiastic about. Now, on the Republican side, here we have Donald Trump as the front runner for the Republican nomination. And Trump, of course, was previously president, but then he lost in the subsequent election when he ran for president again. In 1968, the Republican nominee, the frontrunner, was Richard Nixon. He hadn't been the incumbent president, but he had been the incumbent vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and he lost the presidential election of 1960. So right after being vice president, he ran for president, and he lost to John F. Kennedy, who was, as you know, assassinated. So parallel there as well. I hope that doesn't presage that Trump is going to win, because things won't pan out exactly like 1968 unless life is even weirder than I thought it is. Another parallel is that young people were very active in the 1960s as well as in this decade here. You have protests. You have the Black Power movement in the 1960s and the Black Lives Matters movement in the 2020s. You have marches and demonstrations against the Vietnam War in the 1960s, and marches and demonstrations against climate change in the 2020s and going forward. You also have parallels where young people began turning towards socialism. We had the Students for a Democratic Society were very active in 1968, in the 1960s, and they're a socialist group. And now you've got the Democratic Socialists of America, highly active, with a lot of young people involved in that. So there's a parallel there as well. Also, and this one is kind of strange, there was a major conflict in the Middle East right before the election year. In 1967, there was the 6-day war where tensions between Arab nations and the Israelis came to a peak, and Israel attacked Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, defeated them very quickly, and then gained control of some areas that had previously been controlled by other countries, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which are currently the site of major conflict in the Middle East. So, war in the Middle East was a major issue in the year before each of these elections. In fact, the man who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now this is another strange parallel that, not Jr., but Sr. Robert F. Kennedy Sr. was running in the presidential nomination candidate after Johnson withdrew, and he was assassinated after the June California primary in 1968. The man who was convicted of shooting him was from a Jordanian Christian family who allegedly said that he shot Kennedy because of his support for Israel and his neglect of the rights of Palestinians. I hope this coming election year does not have a parallel in assassinations. Of course, Martin Luther King was also assassinated in 1968, or in riots at a major party national convention like there was for the Democratic Party in 1968. Seems more likely that there would be some kind of riots and turmoil in the Republican convention in the upcoming year, but who knows? I don't expect everything to exactly match and rhyme, but those things are strange enough that it shows signs that lots of things could affect how things turn out next year, and we are in a position where it looks like we're heading towards some kind of major change in what kind of voters support which party, and Kennedy's campaign may be a big factor in peeling people away from one of the parties who would then become up for grabs by the other party. Don't know how it's going to turn out, but I expect maybe the big issues, if some candidate chooses to, in the future, pick up on them, will be to take climate change much more seriously and to address the economic concerns of young people. This is going back to like Bernie Sanders, right? Once again. So maybe Sanders run again. I don't think so, but maybe a younger version of Sanders down the road. Who knows? That's it for this week. Thanks once again for listening, and I hope you come back next time. I think I'll have one more episode, and then getting nearer to Thanksgiving, I'll take at least a week or two off and join you again in late November, early December. So remember, if you like this show, you can subscribe to it, like it, share it with other people, hit the notification button, all that stuff, and we'll see you again, or at least you'll see me again sometime in the coming weeks. Thanks.
With ease, I see the chains are breaking. We gained our focus, the moves we're making will prove to determine our self-worth as a passenger on this vehicle Earth.